Going to start now. Welcome, everybody. I am Joanne Geer. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project, and we want to welcome you to today's program. This is part of our clinical research cohort, and today we'll talk about accessibility and disability in clinical research. Next slide, please. You'll be hearing from Kate Fialkowski and Brittany Haltzman-Cassenti in just a few moments. Go ahead. You will also hear in a little while from the co-chairs of this cohort, Ellen Bedenko and Daria Crean. Westchester Biotech Project was launched in 2017, really as a focus for bringing together researchers, data scientists, and engineers, and those who love them. My co-founder, Michael Welling, is the father of a young man who's a teenager now and a very, very robust kid, and who had to have 2 stem cell transplants as a baby. When the family got through that nightmare and looked around and said, okay, scientists saved our kid's life, what can we do to help? They started to explore the community where they live, which is Westchester County, New York, and which we're just north of New York City, if you're not familiar. The inspiration to support really the whole continuum of scientists, but with a real focus on early career scientists to help to seed tomorrow's workforce is where we found our focus. Next slide, please. The 3 kind of big programs that we are developing, Blueprint 2030, which is kind of cheeky for a little organization like us to do this, but we felt that it was really important to be looking far enough ahead that we could actually be making changes today that would have an impact. The science economy, normally those words would have 2 E's in the middle, but there's just one which stands for everyone. Our career consortium is a combination of looking at the workforce of the future in terms of training and opportunity, and the clinical research cohort is certainly part of this, but it also leads to the big understanding that we've developed from all this work, which is that in our region, there are not enough labs. So we're developing a series of charrettes and other meetings to bring the parties together to develop state-of-the-art, future-oriented laboratories that are appropriate for companies coming out of incubators. So they're going to be between 5,000 and 20,000 square feet, some amount of shared space, and then what else do we know? So we'll be having meetings every month to look into that until we start to see it gel. Next, please. We do this with lots of wonderful partners, and of course we invite you, if you want to become a partner in any way, be in touch with us and we'll be happy to explore what we can do together. Next, please. And we have some great upcoming events. We have an ongoing monthly meeting about the microbiome, which is pretty exciting. We are having our first charrette on the Lab of the Future on the 17th of March. And on the 22nd is our annual conference, which is Innovation in Research. This is the 5th time we've done it, and unfortunately the 2nd time it'll be just online. It's a nice tight 3 hours. And we'll be focusing on breakthroughs in maternal health. And all of this is on our website, westchesterbiotechproject.org, and we hope we'll see you there. Go ahead, Matt. I want to introduce Ellen Bedenko, who is the co-chair of our clinical research cohort. Go ahead, Ellen.
Hello, and thank you so much for introducing me. My name is Ellen Bedenko. I am a registered nurse, and I've been in clinical trials for close to 20 years, and I've done many things. And lately, I started thinking more about how to make trials more accessible and available to everybody, because I firmly believe everybody has to have a choice and an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. A couple of years ago, Daria Crean, a friend of mine, introduced me to Westchester Biotech Project, and Daria and I have been co-chairing the clinical research cohort And I'm very happy to be here with everybody, and I'm very much looking forward to Kate Fialkowski's and Brittany Haltzman-Cassenti's presentations, and then a lively discussion. Thank you.
I just said thank you, Ellen. I realize I flipped the script on you, so thank you for being flexible. Sorry about that. Daria, would you like to say a few words about yourself and about the cohort?
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. My name is Daria, and I am also a nurse. I've been in clinical research now for about 20-something years, and I'm very, very passionate about all different aspects of it. When I came to join Westchester Biotech, it was before the pandemic, and I just saw this random ad for this breakfast in Westchester, and I thought, I've never been to Westchester, and I'm not doing anything that morning, and it's all about life sciences. So I went, and it was one of the best things I've ever done, because I met great people. Joanne and Michael were so welcoming, and then from there, I just really became so engaged in all their different cohorts and their webinars that they have, and the people that they have on these sessions are really eye-opening and so inspiring on every single aspect. So we are focused on the clinical research piece, and I am in clinical research right now. I work in clinical research. I work directly with clinical sites in the US. So I am really looking forward to this talk with Brittany, and I'm sorry, I forgot her name.
Kate.
Kate. Why? I don't know why I want to say Fate. I don't know why, but I'm sorry, Kate. So anyway, the whole disability accessibility piece is huge, and I know just being a little bit involved for a tiny bit of time in a Down syndrome clinical trial that was trying to take off, just all the different obstacles and avenues you have to juggle around, but how challenging and fulfilling that can be. So I'm really looking forward to the talk with these two ladies, so thank you. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you, Daria. So Ellen, did you want to say something more to introduce Kate while she pulls up her slides?
I would love to. Kate Jokowski is a disability advocate and somebody who has been working with the disability community and disability studies for many, many years. And she was my professor at Temple in one of the disability ethics courses. Kate's perspective is invaluable. And because this forum right now is a truly a meeting of people from different perspectives, I think bringing us all together is invaluable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen. So Kate, you want to pull up your slides and unmute? There you go. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Kate. And first, I should say I have no clinical experience whatsoever. So I want to make that perfectly clear. I do, as Ellen said, I teach disability studies at Temple University. Some of those classes include disability ethics. And what I'd like to do today is give you sort of a flyby on some topics related to disability. And I'm going to say not just related to accessibility, but related to welcome. How do we welcome people with disabilities? And welcoming is really what you need to achieve in order to achieve inclusivity. So you can have all of the features and attributes right, but if people don't feel welcomed, then it's still presenting an inhibitor or a barrier to participation. So This is going to go really quickly. I think, you know, the way that we're doing things today is we're going to have two kind of brief presentations, myself and Brittany, and then we can open it up and have a conversation. So I'm looking forward to getting to the conversation side of this session today. Okay, before I get started with slides, no heavy slides, just FYI. I want to point out that about 20% of the population are people with disabilities, and that's a really large number. So disabilities include things that are inhibitors to activities of daily living. It's such a broad definition that all different parts of public policy have different definitions of what a disability is. The way that people experience disability can be very unique to their own experience of it. And sometimes the disability, the inability to fully participate may be based on environmental conditions. So for example, I might not have a disability unless my disability can be exacerbated by a very stressful environment, some type of very rigorous environment like walking up hills or flickering lights. And so it can be environmentally stimulated. So in short, what we're talking about when we say disability is really so nebulous, and yet everybody thinks they know what it is because it's sort of like, I'll know it when I see it, right? That kind of definition. So how do we, knowing that it can be so nebulous and flexible as a term, how do we include people with disabilities? So what I'd like to do really quickly is take you through pictures, really photographs of how we often think of people with disabilities and what works and what doesn't work in that framing. And if you think of it, it's sort of like a marketing approach if you think about marketing. And so what works? How do we attract a particular demographic? How can we think that we're doing something right, but it ends up backfiring? So I'm going to take you through a couple of images and talk about different disability frameworks that are often used and how they work and what happens when it backfires and they don't work. So I'm just going to pull up my first slide real quickly. So the first model that I'm sharing with you is the charity approach to disability. In this particular image that you see on your screen, this is Knights of Columbus. They do an annual campaign to raise money for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they raise a lot of money and they do fantastic work. So the charity approach is something where often we are raising money for a particular demographic of the population, in this case, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we could say that's terrific because there are a lot of people who are benefactors when we raise money. But let's look at it in another way and how people with disabilities themselves respond to some of this kind of framing. Often this kind of framing is based on identifying people with disabilities as tragic, as sufferers, as people who require our pity. In this way, when we reduce a person to the object of pity, then we are dehumanizing that individual. And people don't want to be recognized as objects of pity. Similarly, we may exalt the objects of pity by saying what an inspiration they are. This happens on social media all the time when we talk about people with disabilities as objects of pity and how inspirational they are because they got out of bed this day. And so for the individuals with disabilities who may or may not have that particular disability, suddenly they're in an overarching framework of disability which reduces them to being an object. So I think it's really important to identify if we are marketing, if we have marketing materials, if we're trying to appeal to people with disabilities, if we use this charity perspective, the inspirational perspective, it can also have the result of being seen as something that is reductive and exclusionary. It appeals a lot to benefactors, but it can really backfire for people with disabilities who see themselves in this, reduced, non-human form and objectified. I'm moving to the next slide. The next approach, which is a really typical approach that we see, is something that we would call a medical approach. In this image, you see a silhouette of a wheelchair, and next to the silhouette of a wheelchair is what appears to be a child with a visible prosthetic leg. The child is standing on two legs and with their arms outraised, with an arm upraised in sort of like an overcoming or happy achievement pose. In the medical approach, disability is something to be overcome, that there is an impairment. The impairment needs some sort of intervention or some sort of cure. In the case of the medical approach, we're striving to ameliorate the impairment, and we are striving to move towards what we consider the ideal in a normal framework. In this case, we're saying that the individual must really conform to what normal looks like. And the authority in this approach, obviously, are doctors or healthcare providers, health authorities. So I think we would all agree that medical interventions ameliorating an impairment is important, that to be able to have a cure for some diseases is very, very, very important. And at the same time, it can also be considered reductive. So when we see the individual as the impairment, when we see the cure as eradicating people with that impairment, that takes us to a different place of eugenics. And so all of these models have their place, but if they're not positioned correctly, we can be saying something really detrimental to people with disabilities. So for example, in a hospital setting, if there's a number of different rooms and people who need treatments, and we say to someone else, hey, the wheelchair in room 2 needs a whatever, then that suddenly has reduced the individual to their device, in this case, the wheelchair, which is clearly an object and can reduce the person to an object. So the medical approach obviously has its upsides, but based on the positioning and the way that it appears, can also be interpreted by individuals with disabilities that the only way they fit in is to be normalized, and that an individual can be reduced to that specific diagnostic condition or impairment. So what I want to say about this image is, you may look at this image and think this image makes perfect sense. Yes, who wouldn't want to move out of the wheelchair and to be standing upright? And why wouldn't that be considered something like a victory? For people who use mobility aids, a wheelchair itself can be considered freedom and not considered something that is constraining. And so this can have different messaging, be received as different messaging in different populations. I'm going to move to the next slide. Another approach that we often see, again, in social media, in marketing materials, is the rights approach. In this case, this is based on legal access through laws such as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example. In this approach, individuals with disabilities had to go through litigious processes in order to earn the right to access, in order to earn the right to access billings, to earn the right to access transportation, to earn the right to access education, the right to access living in a community and not by default being institutionalized. And so the rights approach really has undergirding it the fact that individuals with disabilities did not have the same human rights as individuals without disabilities. And in order to have access, they had to legally win access. And it was considered that only through having the access to education, to employment, to the community, to transportation, that individuals had to win their humanity. Things that other people would consider just the natural right of being human, individuals with disabilities had to earn that right. I want to just mention a side note based on something that Ellen said at the beginning. So historically, individuals with disabilities, various disabilities, were considered vulnerable populations and required heightened securities in internal review boards. Individuals with certain disabilities were exempted from clinical research based on their disability. Individuals with Down syndrome, for example, in another example, were automatically excluded from transplants. And so even in the medical arena, in clinical research, in many topics across life, individuals with disabilities had to file lawsuits in order to gain access to those environments, conditions, opportunities. My next slide. The last approach is really, really important. And the last approach is justice. And are we treating people with disabilities as full human persons without saying that they have to be normalized in some way to have that human status? And in the justice approach, we really have to consider how many things together create disparities and disproportionality. So the co-occurrence of poverty, the co-occurrence of being in a food desert, the co-occurrence of the color of your skin, a disability, education levels, the co-occurrence of these things can really amplify the disparities that we have in various populations. So the justice approach tries to take an overarching view and say, how can we repeal forms of oppression? How do we work in solidarity together to bring all people along and provide access to all people for fair and equitable treatment and full participation? So I think that that's where I would like to stop, is talking about these frameworks and see where the conversation goes, and then we can move into specific questions about technical accessibility if we want. But I really wanted to start with, how do we talk about people with disabilities to invite people with disabilities for full participation, and how do we welcome people? And sometimes the way we frame things can be the first barrier before we ever get to whether or not materials are readable and accessible. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Kate. And I really, I appreciate the framework that you've put out, and I appreciate the way in which it is intersectional with every other issue of, and I've got a lot of notes for talking about the environment, conditions, and opportunities for all of us. So that was very, very helpful. We're going to hear next from Brittany Haltzman-Cassenti, who is on the front lines of getting people with disabilities engaged in clinical research. Brittany.
Thank you. My name is Brittany Haltzman-Cassenti. I am a senior project manager with a company called mdgroup through a division of our services called Patient Primary. My main responsibility is to work with pharmaceutical companies and CROs and figure out ways for us to get patients to the clinical trial sites, get nurses to the patients if needed, and support patients throughout the journey of their time in the clinical trial. I work very closely with some companies that do some rare disease trials and gene therapy, and I'll talk about that towards the end, as these populations do often require a lot of special assistance to get them through the clinical trial journey. Just a few things to note, and you may already be familiar with a lot of this information, but some common reasons that folks drop out of trials. It may be that the trial is in an inconvenient location. For example, the patient lives in the rural parts of the state and the hospital is in the city center, and it's inconvenient for them to get there. There could be scheduling conflicts, personal family matters, such as multiple children, or they may have a spouse that works all the time and can't support them. They're physically unable, so they may be that they have physical restraints, that they cannot walk or get themselves around easily. They could have financial constraints. They might not appreciate the clinical trial and what it can do for them and their health. They could forget their visits, and they could just simply have fear and anxiety about participating in a clinical trial. And what we try to do at Patient Primary is eliminate these barriers to help patients stay in clinical trials. And one of the things that is not often recognized is the health matters or disabilities that affect the patient from getting to the clinical trial that are outside of the actual indication of the trial. So often the sites, the physicians are focused on what the study is looking at, but they don't think about some of the other things that are affecting the patient. And for that reason, the patient may drop out as well. One thing that's important, and something that I've learned as I was a study coordinator, is that it's important for clinical staff to focus on more than just the indication of the study, as I mentioned. You may be looking at a trial that's looking at patients that have a certain cancer or a certain disease, but what about the rest of the person and what would keep them in the trial? Does the patient need assistance getting from the front door to your clinic? Does the patient need assistance with a language barrier? Does the patient have a hearing disability? Are there various things that you can do to help keep them in the trial? The study staff should feel comfortable to assist patients with these additional services to make their participation easier. Many hospitals and clinical settings do have access to translators, interpreters, rental wheelchairs, for example, or other materials that could help assist the patient. And it's important for study staff to feel comfortable to have these types of conversations with patients and caregivers about what other things would help their participation. If you're looking at an ultra rare disease where you have to bring a patient from halfway across the country, what comforts from home would help with the patient? For example, would they need something like a food processor because the patient has a feeding tube? That goes into my next slide where some examples of assistance that we've provided in pediatric gene therapy trials are things like food processors for dietary needs. The patients are required to have their meals through feeding tubes, so it's important for the family to have access to a food processor to process the meal and make it amenable to the feeding tube. Do they need access to a stroller or a wheelchair rental? They've traveled, they're away from home, they don't have the appropriate equipment because it's financially not suitable. Is there some way that we can assist by renting a stroller or a wheelchair for them? Do they need additional medical support? Do they have medical needs outside of the clinical trial that we can help find local clinics or support them with getting to the hospital? Do they need special assistance while traveling to the clinical site? They drive a vehicle that is not conducive for a wheelchair. So they fold up the patient's wheelchair and they put them in the vehicle, but it's very uncomfortable. can we book a ground transfer that would either A, allow the patient to remain in their wheelchair, or just give a little bit more legroom for the patient? And how can we support the whole family while they're in the trial? One really important point is that when it's a pediatric trial, first and foremost, but a trial in general, how can we support the whole family? It's often not just the patient or even the patient mom and dad that we have to worry about. There could be siblings involved as well. And it's important to support them and their needs so that the patient feels comfortable and the family feels comfortable to continue the clinical trial journey. These are just a few examples of ways that we've supported these specific patients. There's a whole host of ways that we can support other patients with varying disabilities, but most important, and I just want to emphasize that the clinic needs to have these conversations with the families. We can have these conversations, but at the clinical site, it's important for those conversations to be had so that patients feel that they're cared for, that they're understood, and that they want to continue their clinical trial journey. Those are all of the points that I have. I'm very excited to hear our discussion and some more points, and I look forward to that.